Islam. It's a way of life for nearly a quarter of all humanity, and yet, for many of us, it's still surrounded by a lot of questions. So let's dive in and build a clear, foundational understanding of the world's second largest religion.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll get a sense of the sheer scale of this global faith. Then we'll get into the story of its founder, Muhammad. After that, we'll unpack the core beliefs and practices. And finally, we'll clear up some of the most talked about concepts like Sharia, halal, and the role of women.
Okay, so let's start with the big picture. Just how vast and incredibly diverse the global Muslim community, also known as the Ummah, really is.
The number itself is just staggering. 1.8 billion followers. I mean, let that sink in for a second. That's almost 24% of the entire world's population. Nearly 1 in every 4 people on the planet. And it's the majority faith in 49 different countries, from Albania to Nigeria to Kazakhstan.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because this chart right here busts a huge myth. A lot of people think Islam is an Arab religion, but only about 20% of Muslims today are actually Arab. The country with the single largest Muslim population, it's Indonesia, and a huge chunk, about 30%, live on the Indian subcontinent. It is a truly global faith.
The name itself tells you so much. The word Islam literally means submission to God. But what's really fascinating is that its linguistic root, it's the exact same root for words like salam in Arabic and shalom in Hebrew, both meaning peace. So the core idea is that through submission to God's will, one finds true peace and security.
And that flows right into the definition of a Muslim. If Islam is the act of submission, then a Muslim is simply a person who submits to God. Pretty straightforward, right?
So how did this all start? Where did this global faith come from? Well, for that, we have to go back to the very beginning and look at the life of its founder, Muhammad.
Now, before we do, a quick and really important note. To avoid any form of idol worship, Islamic tradition strongly discourages making images or pictures of its prophets. So, out of deep respect for that tradition, we'll be using this silhouette to represent the Prophet Muhammad.
Muhammad was born in Mecca back in 570 CE and was orphaned when he was very young. For 40 years, he was a merchant and family man, but then everything changed. He began receiving what he said were revelations from God, delivered by the angel Gabriel. Now his message, that there was only one God and that society needed to care for the poor, was radical, and it made the powerful tribes in Mecca really angry. After facing years of persecution, he and his followers fled to the city of Medina in 622. This event, the Hijrah, was so monumental it marks year 1 on the Islamic calendar. But the story doesn't stop there. 8 years later, he returned to Mecca, not as an outcast, but as a leader with 10,000 followers. He cleansed the sacred Kaaba of its idols, and by the time he died just 2 years later, had united most of Arabia.
After Muhammad's death, a huge question came up. Who's next? Who should lead the community? And the answer to that question created the faith's biggest split. One group believed the next leader should be chosen by consensus, and they elected Abu Bakr, Muhammad's close friend and father-in-law. They became known as the Sunni. But another group believed that Muhammad had already chosen his successor, his cousin and son-in-law, Ali. They became the Shia. This fundamental disagreement over leadership is the origin of the Sunni-Shia divide we still see today.
Okay, so we've got the history. But what do Muslims actually believe? What are the core ideas and practices that shape their daily lives? Let's get into the foundation of the faith.
The number one, absolute bedrock of the faith is belief in one and only one God. And by the way, Allah is just the Arabic word for God. In fact, Muslims believe they worship the very same God as Christians and Jews. They also believe in a whole line of prophets you've probably heard of, like Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. They see Muhammad as the final prophet in that line. They also honor the Torah and the Gospel as holy books, but believe the Quran is God's final and complete revelation to humanity. And all of this builds towards a belief in a final day of judgment where every person will be held accountable for their deeds.
So, how do you put those beliefs into practice? Well, that's where the 5 pillars of Islam come in. The first is the Shahada, the simple declaration of faith. The second is Salat, the 5 daily prayers a Muslim performs while facing the Kaaba in Mecca. Third is Zakat, an annual donation of 2.5% of your wealth to those in need. Fourth is Psalm, fasting from sunrise to sunset during the holy month of Ramadan. And fifth is the Hajj, the special pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim who is physically and financially able should make at least once in their life.
And to give you an idea of the real-world impact of these pillars, let's just look at one of them, zakat. Estimates suggest that the amount given by Muslims to charity every single year is somewhere between $200 billion and a mind-boggling $1 trillion. It's one of the largest forms of wealth transfer to the poor on the entire planet.
All right, for our last section, we're going to tackle some of the topics you probably hear about the most when Islam comes up, concepts that can sometimes be a bit misunderstood. We're going to try and add some clarity. So let's start with the role of women, a huge topic of conversation. Now, the Quran itself, for its time, was actually pretty revolutionary. It explicitly guarantees women the right to own property, to work, and to initiate a divorce. And it directly attacks the idea that women are somehow inferior to men. Now, customs like veiling are common in many cultures, but the Quran's primary instruction is actually for both men and women, a general call to dress and act with modesty.
And if you want a sense of the historical importance placed on female empowerment, just look at this quote. It's attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, and it directly connects a father's salvation in the afterlife to whether or not he provides his daughter with a good education.
Next up, halal. You've probably heard the word, but what does it really mean? Well, it's simply the Arabic word for permissible. The opposite is haram, or forbidden, which includes things like pork, blood, and alcohol. But when it comes to meat, it's not just about what you can eat, it's also about how. The rules for halal slaughter are actually all about ethics. The animal must be treated humanely, must not suffer or be frightened, and the process must be quick and painless. Animal cruelty is strictly outlawed.
And that brings us to maybe the biggest, most talked about, and least understood concept of all, Sharia. So, what exactly is it?
Well, the literal translation is actually beautiful. Sharia means the path to a waterhole. I mean, just imagine you're in the desert. That path is literally the path to life. So Sharia isn't a book of laws. It's the divine, ideal way a Muslim should try to live to be close to God. It covers everything, from prayer to ethics to how you treat your family and neighbors.
And this brings us to probably the single most important thing to understand here, the difference between Sharia and something called fiqh. Think of Sharia as the divine, perfect, unchanging ideal, the path from God. Fiqh, on the other hand, is Islamic law. It's the body of rules and regulations created by human scholars trying their best to interpret Sharia. And because fiqh is a human effort, it's considered fallible, it's changeable, and it has evolved and been debated for centuries. So much of the confusion out there comes from mixing up the perfect, divine ideal of Sharia with the human, imperfect interpretation of fiqh.
And really, that whole process of human interpretation is still going on today, which leaves us with a final fascinating question to think about. How does a faith with 1,400 years of history continue to interpret its divine path to navigate all the complex challenges and questions of our modern 21st century world?